Can faith exist without symbols? When a reporter challenges her beliefs, Karoline's response will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about authenticity. The tension in the room was palpable as the camera crews made their final adjustments. Karoline sat across from the reporter, her posture poised, exuding a quiet but undeniable strength. Michael, a seasoned journalist known for his sharp questioning, was prepared for what he assumed would be just another interview. He had researched Karoline. Her unwavering faith was well known, shaping every aspect of her life. But today, he wanted to push its limits to see if cracks would emerge. The overhead lights hummed as the cameras began rolling. Michael's voice carried an air of subtle challenge. "So, Karoline," he began, his tone deliberately smooth, "you often talk about faith being the foundation of your life. But I noticed something today. No cross. Seems like faith is just for show." The words were meant to provoke, but Karoline remained composed, her hands resting steadily in her lap. A brief silence followed. Michael had expected hesitation, maybe even a flicker of self-doubt. He had seen it before. But Karoline was different. Her faith wasn't an ornament to be displayed. It was woven into her very being. She didn't need a cross around her neck to prove her devotion. To her, faith wasn't about external validation. It was in her thoughts, her actions, and how she treated others. Michael had assumed that because she wasn't wearing a visible symbol, her faith was somehow diminished. But Karoline wasn't rattled. Instead of reacting defensively, she met his gaze with steady confidence. She had faced these questions before, designed to provoke, to challenge. But this one felt deeper. It wasn't about her. It was about something far greater. Michael shifted in his seat, sensing that she wouldn't take the bait. He leaned forward, pressing further. "It's just interesting," he continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "You preach about faith's importance, but without the symbols, without any visible sign, isn't it just an illusion?" The implication was clear. He wanted her to falter, to reveal some vulnerability. But what Michael didn't understand was simple. Her faith wasn't for him. It wasn't for public display or validation. It was hers, and that was enough. A charged silence settled between them. But Karoline didn't rush to respond. She let the quiet stretch, making him sit in his own discomfort. And in that moment, the answer was already clear. Faith isn't about what the world sees, it's about what truly resides within. But Karoline wasn't someone who could be shaken so easily. She knew it was time to speak. Michael's patience was thinning as he watched her sit there, unruffled, as if his question hadn't even fazed her. He had expected a defensive response, maybe an apology or an attempt to justify herself. But instead, she remained still, her composure unwavering. To him, she was just another person of faith, hiding behind a calm exterior. If she wasn't going to take the bait, he would have to push harder. "Well, Karoline," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice amplified by the microphone. "You talk about faith all the time, but the world has seen enough of people who wear their beliefs on their sleeves. There are plenty of so-called believers out there who claim one thing and do another. So tell me, how do we know you're not just another example?" Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she sat up a little straighter, as though preparing herself for a conversation that demanded more than a simple reply. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "I don't wear my faith to prove anything to anyone," she said, each word deliberate. "My actions speak louder than any cross, any title, any symbol I could display." The simplicity of her words carried undeniable weight, but Michael wasn't done yet. He was still searching for a weak spot, a moment where she might falter. "Actions, huh?" he said with a smirk. "But what about when those actions seem more about you than about your faith? When people can't tell the difference between what's done for attention and what's done out of true belief?" He paused, watching her closely. "Doesn't that bother you?" A shift in the air occurred, almost imperceptible. Karoline's expression didn't change, but the quiet strength she exuded became even more apparent. She wasn't angry, but something in her eyes flickered. a spark of clarity as though she was letting him glimpse a deeper part of her. "Faith isn't about what others think of me," she said, her voice calm but now carrying a subtle edge. "It's about the work I do, the impact I make. If you're looking for a show, you won't find one here. I don't live for validation, and I certainly don't answer to the crowd." Michael refused to back down. "So you're saying it's just about you? That the world should just take your word for it?" Karoline's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "No," she said, almost as if speaking to herself. "I'm saying it's about making a difference even when no one is watching. It's about staying true to what I believe in, whether people understand it or not." Michael's expression darkened. He had expected an easier target, someone who would be shaken, caught off guard. Instead, he found himself face to face with someone whose belief was deeply rooted, immovable. Her refusal to react defensively was, in itself, unsettling. "I see," he muttered, leaning back slightly as though trying to regain control of the conversation. "But tell me this, Karoline. Faith might be personal, but the world isn't. What if the world judges you? What if they don't see your good?" A long silence stretched between them. This time it was Karoline who leaned forward, her voice dropping to a soft, unwavering whisper that cut through the tension like a blade. "If the world judges me, Michael," she said, each word deliberate, "that's their choice. But I won't change who I am to meet their expectations. Isn't that what faith truly is? Not bending to fit in, but standing firm in what you know is right." Something flickered in Michael's eyes, and for a brief moment the room felt heavier, as if the very air had thickened around them. He had expected pushback, maybe even an outburst, anything that would confirm his assumption that she was just like the rest. But instead, he was met with something unsettling. Clarity. And Karoline wasn't finished. Michael shifted in his chair, his usual confidence wavering. The smirk he had worn so easily now faded as the weight of her words settled. He had wanted to provoke emotion, to find a crack in her resolve. But what he had uncovered was something far more unshakable. A quiet strength that couldn't be challenged. Karoline felt the moment stretch between them, an unspoken shift in power. She could have filled the silence with more words, with explanations or justifications, but she knew better. Some battles weren't won through argument. Sometimes the most powerful response was stillness. Her gaze drifted briefly past Michael, landing on a framed picture hanging on the studio wall. It was a landscape, one she recognized. A small, quiet town she had visited years ago on a retreat. A place where life was simple, untouched by the constant need for validation. She had gone there in search of something, and what she found was a reminder that true peace came from within. She hadn't thought about that place in years, but now, as she sat across from a man who was trying so hard to expose contradictions that didn't exist, she understood why it mattered. This interview wasn't about proving anything. It wasn't about making someone else believe in her faith. It was about knowing who she was, even when the world didn't understand. A slow breath escaped her lips, not out of relief but realization. She had spent years on this journey, learning that faith wasn't an accessory or a performance. It wasn't something that needed defending. It was in the way she lived, the way she treated people, the way she met challenges like this, with grace instead of anger. The silence deepened, pressing in on the room like an unseen force. And for the first time, Michael had nothing to say. He had spent the entire interview pressing, mocking, trying to force a reaction. But instead of hostility, he had been met with something far more powerful: conviction. And Karoline knew in that moment that this wasn't just about faith. This was about authenticity. This was about standing firm, no matter who was watching. She met Michael's gaze one last time, and for the first time since the camera started rolling, it wasn't her belief that was being questioned. It was his own assumptions. The loudest beliefs were never the ones shouted from rooftops. They were the quiet ones, the ones that did not seek to be heard but were impossible to ignore. The room was still, yet charged with an unspoken tension, Michael's eyes flickered, back and forth, his mind racing for his next move. But for Karoline, this battle was no longer about words. It was about standing firm in who she was, no matter how hard others tried to unravel the fabric of her beliefs. And then, as if sensing the finality in the air, Michael posed one last question, the one he thought might finally break her. The silence stretched longer than he intended. He shifted in his chair, suddenly uneasy, as if his entire strategy was slipping from his grasp. He had come prepared to challenge her, to provoke anger or defensiveness. But instead, she had done something far more powerful. She had met his fire with stillness. She was unshaken. Michael leaned forward again, his voice edged with frustration. So you really think the world should just accept that, Karoline? That faith is something private, something that doesn't need to be seen or acknowledged? That people don't need to understand why you believe what you do? His eyes narrowed, grasping for any weakness. Isn't it a little hypocritical to talk about faith without showing it in a way people expect? Karoline let the question settle, allowing the weight of it to hang in the air. But the pressure didn't faze her. She had spent years wrestling with these very thoughts, shaping and reshaping what faith meant to her. And now, in this moment, she knew exactly where she stood. Her eyes softened, but her voice remained unwavering. Michael, she said evenly, faith is not a performance. It's not a show meant for applause. It's not something I wear like a badge hoping for recognition. Faith is something that lives in the heart, in the choices I make, in the way I treat others. She paused, letting her words sink in. If someone can't see it just because it's not wrapped in a symbol, that's not my concern. She continued, her gaze steady. That's between them and their own expectations. Something shifted in Michael's expression. He had walked into this interview thinking he understood faith, thinking he knew what it was supposed to look like. But now, as he sat across from Karoline, he wasn't so sure. She saw the hesitation flicker across his face and pressed forward, not as a defense, but as a truth he needed to hear. People spend so much time trying to measure someone else's faith, she said. They treat it like something to be judged, something to be proven, as if its worth is defined by how loudly you proclaim it. But faith isn't about volume. Faith is about holding on to something in the quiet moments, when no one is watching, when there's no audience, no approval, no validation. It's about choosing kindness when anger is easier. It's about forgiving when it hurts. It's about love, even when it goes unseen. She leaned in slightly, her tone more resolute than ever. And yes, she said, her voice like steel, wrapped in warmth. That is enough. The weight of her words settled over the room. Michael opened his mouth, but no words came. For the first time in the interview, he wasn't sure how to respond. He had been prepared for arguments, for defenses, for contradictions, but he hadn't been prepared for truth. Sometimes people judge. They look at me and assume things because of what I wear, how I speak, where I choose to show up. But you know what? I'm not here to convince them of anything. I'm here to live the truth of what I believe, whether they understand it or not. The words hung in the air, clear and unshakable. Michael sat back, blinking as if processing the enormity of what had just been said. He had expected to pull something out of Karoline. Anger, guilt, maybe even an apology for not fitting into the mold he had set for her. But instead, he had encountered someone whose peace was not for sale. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't defensive. She simply existed in the fullness of her truth, and there was nothing he could do to unravel it. For a long moment, he didn't speak. The studio was still. So still that the low hum of the cameras became the only sound filling the room. The bright lights cast long shadows across the space, but the usual energy, the unspoken battle between interviewer and guest, had dissipated. Something had shifted. The weight of Karoline's words lingered, pressing against Michael in a way he hadn't expected. He was a seasoned journalist, known for his sharp tongue and quick comebacks, but now, for the first time in a long while, he found himself at a loss. The interview had slipped from his hands. His usual tactics, pressing, challenging, pushing, until he found a weak spot, had failed. Karoline wasn't playing his game. She had answered, but not with defensiveness or outrage. She had simply spoken the truth, and somehow that was more disarming than anything else. Michael cleared his throat, reaching for the stack of notes on his desk, but suddenly they felt useless. The questions he had prepared no longer fit the conversation in front of him. He had walked into this interview expecting to expose something, to find cracks in Karoline's belief, to poke at the hypocrisy he was certain was there. But now he realized something unsettling. The mirror had turned. His questions meant to challenge her had only exposed his own assumptions. His belief that faith had to look a certain way, that conviction needed to be loud to be real, that was his bias, not hers. He stole a glance at the monitor beside him, hoping for direction from the producer, but the producer only shrugged. This interview had taken on a life of its own. The camera zoomed in on Karoline, her expression unwavering but softer now. She hadn't come here to win an argument. She hadn't come here to prove anything. And somehow, that had been the most powerful thing of all. She wasn't angry. She wasn't smug. She was simply there, present in a way that was almost disarming. Karoline had responded not just with words, but with an inner peace that spoke louder than any argument could. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room, including Michael, that this interview had shifted. It was no longer a battle of words, but a battle of values. And it was a battle Karoline had already won. The tension that had filled the space gradually faded, replaced by a quiet realization. Michael had sought to expose weakness, to poke holes in her beliefs. But instead, he had uncovered strength, an unshakable, quiet strength that needed no defense. Karoline wasn't just a woman of faith. She was a woman who lived her truth, whether or not the world understood it. And in the end, that was far more powerful than any remark designed to mock or challenge her. The cameras kept rolling, but something had changed. Michael forced a smile, though it felt thin, like an afterthought. "Well, Karoline," he said, attempting to regain control, "I think we've covered everything for today." But the words felt hollow. There was no sharpness in his tone, no biting edge. The interview was over, not because of a dramatic conclusion, but because Karoline had spoken her truth so clearly that there was simply nothing left to say. As the crew began packing up, Karoline stood, a quiet smile touching her lips. She hadn't just answered questions, she had shared a piece of herself, and it was clear that her message had been heard, not just by Michael, but by everyone who had witnessed the exchange. Yet for Karoline, the victory wasn't in silencing Michael or proving a point. It wasn't in making him rethink his stance or forcing a dramatic realization. The victory was in remaining true to herself, undeterred, unshaken. The room, once buzzing with the tension of confrontation, now felt quieter, almost reverent. Karoline moved toward the exit, her posture just as steady as when she had entered. The dimming studio lights couldn't take away the quiet certainty she carried with her. She wasn't walking away from a debate she had won. She was walking away from the truth she had simply shared, unchanged, unwavering. As she stepped off set, the producer, who had been watching from the back of the room, approached her. He hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Karoline," he said slowly, "I've been in this business a long time. I've seen a lot of interviews, but that was different. You didn't just stand your ground. You changed the entire dynamic of the conversation." Karoline smiled. Not with pride, but with quiet understanding. "It wasn't about changing anything," she said, her voice soft but certain. "It was about staying true to who I am, no matter how it's received." The producer nodded, still processing her words. He had expected conflict, resistance, a dramatic answer that would bring closure to the interview. Instead, he had witnessed something deeper, something that didn't need theatrics to be powerful. Karoline had simply been unwavering, and in that, the message had been delivered. As she left the studio, her steps were light, her thoughts quiet. She had always known the importance of holding on to her faith in moments like this, when the world seemed determined to fit belief into its own narrow expectations. But she had never needed to prove anything. Faith was not about performance. It was about living the truth, whether the world understood it or not. But in her heart, Karoline knew the truth. Faith was not something to be showcased for others, it was something to be lived. The lesson was clear, not just for Michael or the crew, but for anyone watching. The true power of faith does not lie in what can be seen or measured by others. It is found in the moments of silence, in the quiet acts of kindness, in the way we choose to live when no one is watching. Faith isn't a show. It isn't a performance to be judged or validated by the world. It is a journey of conviction and authenticity, and in that moment, Karoline had proven that even in a world obsessed with outward displays, true worth lies in the strength of what is unseen. Her message went beyond faith. It was about identity, about refusing to let the world define who we are. It was about standing firm in our convictions, embracing our truths, and letting our actions speak louder than any symbol or proclamation ever could. For those who had been moved by her words, the message was simple, yet profound. Stand firm in who you are, in what you believe, in how you treat others. Do not let the noise of the world force you to compromise your truth. Live authentically, unapologetically, and in the end, the world will come to recognize the quiet strength that lies within you. Because at the end of the day, it is not the loudest voice that leaves the greatest impact. It is the steady, unwavering strength of those who live with purpose and conviction. As the screen faded to black, viewers were left with a question that lingered long after the interview ended.